There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. No thunder, no dramatic music, no clear sign that what's happening will matter years later. They pass quietly. And sometimes, it's the quiet that becomes unbearable. For Ronald Reagan. One of those moments came on an ordinary afternoon, so ordinary that he would later struggle to remember the date, the weather, even what he had eaten that morning. But he never forgot the silence. He was young then, still finding his footing, still learning when to speak and when to listen, still believing that some things could be fixed later. He didn't know yet that later. It's often just another word for never. It was a weekday afternoon in the mid-1930s. The kind that felt suspended between obligations. Reagan had finished a short radio segment earlier than expected and decided to walk instead of returning straight to the studio. He liked walking. It helped him think, helped him feel connected to the places and people he spoke to over the air, but rarely met face to face. The city was alive in a muted way. Streetcars rattled by. Shopkeepers leaned against door frames, watching the day drift. Men stood in small clusters, talking softly about jobs, about bills, about rumors of better times ahead. Reagan walked with his hands in his coat pockets, nodding politely when he recognized someone. He was just another young man passing through the afternoon nothing. About him, yet suggested the weight of a future shaped by words. That was when he noticed the crowd. It wasn't large. 6, maybe 7 people gathered near the steps of a public building. Not angry. Not loud. Just tense. Reagan slowed his pace. Something about the posture of the people caught his attention, the way they stood with their arms crossed. Shoulders tight, eyes fixed on a single figure near the steps. A man, middle-aged, neatly dressed, though his coat was worn at the cuffs. His hat was in his hands, fingers gripping it as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. He was speaking, but softly. Too softly for Reagan to hear at first. Reagan stepped closer. "I'm not asking for special treatment," the man was saying. "Just a chance to explain." City officials stood near him, papers tucked under one arm, impatience written plainly across his face. "We've been over this," the official replied. "The decision's been made." The man swallowed. "I understand that. I need someone to hear me." Something in the man's voice tightened Reagan's chest. It wasn't desperation. It was restraint. The kind that comes when someone has learned not to beg but hopes anyway. Reagan glanced around. No one else spoke. The small crowd watched, silent, curious but detached, as though this were a performance rather than a person's life unfolding. The man continued, his voice trembling just slightly. "I've worked there 14 years. I've never been late. Never missed a shift. If there's been a mistake, there hasn't," the official cut in. "Budget cuts. It's happening everywhere." The man nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I have a family," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to change the system, just to reconsider me." Reagan felt something stir inside him. He knew that tone. He had heard it in his own voice before, when explaining, when justifying, when hoping someone would see him as more than a number. The official sighed. "Sir, I really don't have time for this." The man looked down at his hat. Then, as if gathering the last of his courage, he looked up again. "Then at least let me say this," he said. "I gave everything I had. I just want someone to know that." The official hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine." The man turned toward the small crowd. His eyes passed over faces, some sympathetic, some bored until they landed on Reagan. For a brief second, the world narrowed. The man held Reagan's gaze. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. "Do you see me?" Reagan felt it sharp and unmistakable. He could have spoken. He could have said something simple. Something human. "He's right. Let him finish. Someone should listen." It was known for words, after all. Words came easily to him, but in that moment, something held him back. Fear. Uncertainty? The instinct not to interfere? He told himself it wasn't his place. The silence stretched. The man looked away. The official cleared his throat. "We're done here." The man nodded again, once, slowly then turned and walked down the steps, passing within inches of Reagan as he passed. Reagan caught a glimpse of his face, not angry, not bitter, just emptied, and that was it. The crowd dispersed. The official left. The afternoon resumed its ordinary rhythm. Reagan stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked away. At first, the moment faded into the background of his day. He returned to the studio, read his scripts, smiled into the microphone. Life moved forward, as it always does. But that night, as Reagan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the man's face returned to him not sharply, but persistently, the way he held his hat, the calm in his voice, the brief moment of eye contact. Reagan turned onto his side. I could have said something, he thought, but then came the rationalizations. It wouldn't have changed anything. It wasn't my responsibility. Someone else could have spoken. These thoughts settled him, enough to sleep. For a while, days passed, then weeks. Reagan occasionally thought of the man, but without urgency. Life had a way of demanding attention. Work, ambitions, disappointments of his own. Until one morning, he heard the name. It came casually, slipped into conversation at a diner near the studio. Did you hear about Thomas? One man asked another. Reagan looked up. Which Thomas? The other replied, Thomas Keller, the one from the building department. Found him in his apartment. Heart attack, they think. No heat. Couldn't afford it. The words struck Reagan like a sudden drop. His coffee cup froze halfway. To his lips, Thomas. The man's face snapped into focus. The hat. The steps. The silence. Reagan swallowed hard. They said he'd been let go weeks earlier. The man continued. Never found anything else. Shame, good man. Reagan paid his bill and left, without finishing his breakfast. The air outside felt heavier than usual. He walked without direction, his thoughts spiraling. If I had spoken, if I had said one thing. He stopped walking. The thought he couldn't push away finally surfaced, fully formed. What if silence is a choice too? And worse, what if I chose wrong? That question stayed with him, not as a loud accusation, but as a quiet companion. As Reagan's career advanced, as his voice reached more people, as his words began to matter in ways he hadn't imagined, the memory of that day returned again and again, always at moments. When speaking would have been easier than staying quiet, he began to notice silences everywhere in meetings, in crowds, in the spaces between decisions, and he began to fear them because he knew what silence could cost. He never told anyone about Thomas Keller, not his colleagues, not his friends. It felt too small to mention, too ordinary, and yet it was the ordinary moments that seemed to shape him the most, the ones where no one would ever know. What he almost said years later, long after that afternoon had passed into history. Reagan would describe leadership as the courage to speak when others won't. He would say it with conviction, with warmth. Few people knew where that belief came from. But on quiet nights, when he found himself alone with his thoughts, he remembered the man on the steps, and he wondered not whether he could have saved him, but whether being heard, just once, might have made the silence less heavy. Ronald Reagan never learned whether Thomas Keller had known he was dying that morning, whether the pain came suddenly or slowly, whether there was time to think, to regret, to remember. History doesn't record such things. It rarely does. But Reagan carried the questions anyway, quietly, light stones in his pocket. For a long time, he tried to make peace with the idea that what happened had nothing to do with him. People lost jobs every day. People suffered. People died. The world moved on, and so did he. But the problem with silence is that it doesn't fade. It waits. As Reagan's life expanded, as opportunities appeared where none had existed before, the memory of that afternoon grew sharper, not duller. Success, it turned out, didn't bury regret. It illuminated it. He would be sitting in a radio booth, headphones pressed against his ears, voice steady and confident as thousands listened. And suddenly the image would intrude. A man standing on stone steps, hat in his hands, eyes searching for anyone to acknowledge him. Reagan would falter for half a second, barely noticeable to anyone else, then continue as if nothing had happened. But inside, something tightened. "You didn't speak," the voice inside him would say. "And because you didn't, no one did." As the years passed, Reagan found himself increasingly aware of moments when silence hovered like a decision waiting to be made. Meetings where someone was dismissed too quickly. Conversations where a voice was ignored because it was inconvenient. Situations where speaking up would have been uncomfortable, or unpopular, or risky. Each time, Thomas Keller stood invisibly beside him, not accusing, just present. Reagan began to understand something he hadn't grasped as a younger man, that silence is rarely neutral. It doesn't simply happen. It is chosen, often out of fear, sometimes out of caution, occasionally out of selfishness, and it always leaves a mark. Hollywood came, and with it, a new kind of noise. Scripts, cameras, applause. Reagan learned how easily people could be swept up in performance, how readily they accepted what was projected in front of them. He played heroes, leaders, men who spoke at the right moment and changed the course of events with a single line. The irony was not lost on him. Between takes, when the set fell quiet and people moved on to the next scene, Reagan sometimes sat alone, thinking about how many real lives didn't come with second takes. How many moments passed once and never returned. Once, during a long shoot, a young actor confided in him about being treated unfairly by a producer. The story was familiar. Power, dismissal, quiet suffering. Reagan listened, nodding, sympathetic. Then the young man asked, "Do you think I should say something?" Reagan hesitated, just for a moment, and in that moment, the memory surged forward, sharp and unmistakable. "Yes," Reagan said firmly. "You should." The young man looked surprised. "Really?" "Yes," Reagan replied. "Even if nothing changes, you should be heard." It wasn't a grand act. It wouldn't make headlines. But as the young actor walked away, shoulders straighter than before, Reagan felt a subtle shift inside himself. A small correction. When Reagan entered politics, the stakes grew heavier. Silence in that world carried consequences measured not just in personal regret, but in policy. In lives affected far beyond a single afternoon, he discovered that leadership demanded something more than vision or charisma. It demanded interventions, sometimes at the cost of comfort, sometimes at the cost of approval, and still. There were moments when he hesitated, moments when the weight of responsibility made him cautious, when the fear of unintended consequences pulled him back from speaking. In those moments, Thomas Keller returned, not as a specific memory, but as a principle. "If you say nothing," the principle whispered. "You have still chosen." Reagan began to speak more deliberately, more intentionally. He learned to ask questions others avoided, to slow down decisions that felt rushed, to insist that people explain themselves, not to challenge authority, but to humanize it. Those who worked with him noticed it. "He listens," they would say. "He doesn't rush past people." Few understood why that mattered so deeply to him. There came a moment, years later, that crystallized everything. Reagan was governor then. Standing in a hallway after a long day of meetings, a junior staffer, young, nervous, clearly out of place, approached him hesitantly. "Governor Reagan?" the staffer asked. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Reagan could have waved him off. He was tired. There were other commitments waiting. People of greater importance demanded his attention. But something in the young man's voice stopped him. "Yes," Reagan said. "What's on your mind?" The staffer spoke quietly about a concern minor, procedural, easy to dismiss. A small issue affecting a handful of workers. It's unlikely to gain attention or political capital. Reagan listened without interrupting. When the staffer finished, Reagan nodded. "Thank you for telling me, Will. Will anything be done?" The young man asked almost apologetically. Reagan paused, then said, "I don't know yet, but I hear you, and that matters." The staffer left, looking relieved. Not because the problem was solved, but because it had been acknowledged. Reagan stood alone in the hallway for a moment afterward, thinking about how close he had come once to offering nothing but silence. As president, Reagan faced decisions far beyond the scale of one man on stone steps. Nations, economies, ideologies, all demanded attention. Silence in that arena could be interpreted as weakness or restraint, depending on who was watching. Yet even then, in the most powerful rooms in the world, he remained aware of the quiet moments, the overlooked voices, the unspoken consequences. He spoke often about dignity, about responsibility, about the importance of the individual. Some dismissed it as rhetoric. Reagan knew better. Those words were rooted in a memory that never left him in his later years. As memory began to falter and time softened the edges of so many experiences, Thomas Keller remained strangely intact. Reagan could no longer recall dates clearly. Names sometimes slipped away. But the image of a man holding a hat on stone steps endured. It endured because it was not about facts. It was about feeling. One afternoon, sitting with Nancy in the quiet of their home, Reagan grew unusually reflective. He stared out the window for a long time before speaking. "Nancy," he said softly, "do you ever think about the things we didn't do?" She looked at him carefully. "Sometimes," she replied. "Why?" He shook his head slightly. "No reason, just thinking." He didn't tell her the story. He never had. Some memories, he believed, were not meant to be shared. They were meant to guide. Near the end of his life, Reagan found himself returning again and again to a simple idea. That leadership was less about commanding attention and more about recognizing it, about knowing when to speak, understanding when silence could do harm. If he could speak to his younger self now, and the young man standing on the edge of a crowd, unsure whether it was his place to intervene, he knew exactly what he would say. Say something. Even if your voice shakes, even if it changes nothing, because sometimes being heard is the difference between carrying on and giving up. Thomas Keller never knew Ronald Reagan's name. He never knew that the young man watching him that afternoon would one day shape history. He never knew that his quiet dignity, his restrained plea, his brief search for acknowledgement would echo through decades of decisions. But he mattered. He mattered because he taught someone. Without ever realizing it, the cost of silence, and that lesson lived on. In the end, Reagan did not measure his life by the words he spoke, but by the silences he chose to break. That afternoon, the day he said, nothing became. The day he learned that silence is never empty. It is full of consequences, and once you understand that, you never hear the world the same way again. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a moment you wish you had spoken up, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. These stories exist to be remembered. Thank you for listening.